In this video, we're going to examine a new trailer released by Netflix for the documentary The Investigation of Lucy Letby. This has been spoken about for quite some time, and ironically, I was discussing this with a friend of mine yesterday, and we were wondering what happened to Netflix, and now they've finally announced that their documentary will be released in the next couple of weeks. So Netflix have put a trailer on YouTube, and in this video, we're going to examine and analyse the content of that trailer. The trailer begins with some shaky camera footage. It feels like it is probably body cam footage, and we see the other semi-detached houses that are neighbouring the home of Lucy Letby when she's arrested for the first time in Chester. We then see this statement from Netflix, and we're told that the following footage has never been released publicly. So there are a couple of very obvious questions that would follow on the back from that. The first question is, why has it never been released publicly previously? That will become more relevant as we continue into the video. And the second question would be, why is it being released now? The timing of this does seem rather coincidentally conjoined with the Crown Prosecution Service recently rejecting this second tranche of charges against Lucy Letby, and then Cheshire Police essentially making idiots of themselves by releasing a really embarrassing and unprofessional statement. Furthermore, there is footage even in this trailer which gives us a very different version of events to those that were reported in court. Finally, there are also numerous ethical questions regarding this documentary. We'll see when it's released whether it really deserves to be described as a documentary or whether it's just essentially entertainment, but let's give them the benefit of the doubt and assume that it does document relevant things in a constructive way. Regardless of that, it seems deeply inappropriate for Netflix to have been offered this footage by the police, and there are many other questions aside from this that will crop up as we go through the footage. So we then see the moment that Lucy is apparently arrested. We see on the screen this commentary, "I'm arresting you on suspicion of murder and attempted murder," and they are seemingly barging into Lucy's bedroom. Because in the next segment of footage, we see Lucy with her bedclothes wrapped around her, apparently still in bed. Now, I'm not going to discuss that too much at this point because we're going to reflect on that at the end of this section. We then see Lucy obviously looking distraught, dressed in nightwear, and then there is further footage of her being led out of her house, still wearing nightwear. Even the BBC show footage from the documentary of Lucy in bed, as I mentioned, with her bedclothes wrapped around her body. I will just reflect on for a second the fact that the BBC managed to report this. Somehow this is newsworthy, the fact that there's a Netflix documentary, but all of the incredible things that have been uncovered, everything that points to Lucy's innocence, the kind of things that have been reported by, every other news outlet in the country, somehow the BBC have always managed to marginalise those things, or indeed often not report them at all. But they've managed to report the production of a Netflix documentary that's not even news, so I'll just leave people to reflect on why that might be. In this next segment, and the next image from the documentary, which is the very next sequence, we see the Lee Cooper clothing that has become infamous because it's been discussed at length online and was also discussed during the court case. As we can see here, that is beneath Lucy's nightclothes, but also she hasn't changed into it. She's just been taken out of the house wearing it, and she was obviously wearing it to bed because she was taken out of her bed. Another thing to mention here as well is that it seems that Lucy is trying to protect her father. I believe she was with her father at the time. It's certainly one of her parents, and she's saying to him, "Don't look, just go in," which is a very noble act, of course, but there is no way that you can protect a parent in those circumstances. And that should remind us once again that Lucy's parents are living this life sentence with her. They might as well have a life sentence themselves. It's incredibly, enormously, colossally traumatic for them. And a lot of things are spoken about the parents of the infants, and it's obviously absolutely right for us to acknowledge that they've been through traumatic experiences, and we should never forget that. We should also never forget that Lucy's parents have been and are going through an incredibly traumatic experience on a daily basis, and it has been noted that Lucy's father is certainly not young, and I only hope that they can be reunited with their daughter at some point in the foreseeable future. So we see Lucy in night clothes outside of her house. We see the sequence of the arrest, and we learn a lot about what happened on that fateful day. Now, there is no doubt whatsoever that the police have deliberately suppressed this. They have released footage previously that gives a completely false impression of what occurred. Now, you might wonder, if you're not familiar with all the aspects of the case, why would they do something that appears to be so apparently trivial? The answer is because the prosecution made a big deal out of Lucy stating that she was wearing her pyjamas when she was arrested. The prosecution tried to make it seem as if this was untrue. Indeed, I've discussed this in previous videos. This is a TikTok video that was made from a segment of one of my YouTube videos. I dubbed this Pyjamagate. It was a significant portion of the trial in which the prosecuting barrister, Nick Johnson, tried to claim that Lucy Letby was lying about wearing pyjamas. So there are two things to say about that. The first thing is, we now know that this is completely untrue. The prosecution was essentially lying in court, not for the first time, because we've caught them lying on other occasions, and we also know that Lucy Letby's version of events is absolutely correct. Secondly, I know several people who spent a lot of time in court during the original trial, and I know that the police had a considerable presence in court. Of course, there were numerous police officers involved in the court case itself, but there was also a phalanx of officers who were there to, quote, protect the families. So there were, I'm not sure how many exactly, I couldn't put a precise ballpark figure on it, but there were numerous police officers in that courtroom, and they sat there and they watched the prosecution and they listened to the prosecution say things that they knew were completely untrue. They made claims about Lucy Letby. The prosecution made claims that suggested that Lucy Letby was a liar, and in fact, it was Nick Johnson, the prosecutor, who was lying. Now, if I'm going to be incredibly generous, there is a tiny possibility that Nick Johnson didn't know that he was lying and that he had been misled by the police. That's possible. It's not likely, but it's possible. But the police 100% knew that he was lying. And in fact, that's why they've edited previous footage to try to make it look like the prosecution case was legitimate. Why they've released this now, I really don't know. I guess it's just kind of a desperate attempt to curry public opinion. But we will go back to discussing that aspect later in the video. So you can see on the screen here a Daily Telegraph article written by Sarah Napton from today. Lucy Letby was arrested in bed, new footage shows. Clip features in trailer for Netflix documentary on neonatal nurse. So not only was Lucy's version of events correct, but it was, if anything, her playing it down. She could have said, they marched into my bedroom, they arrested me while I was still in bed, I had the bedclothes all the way around me. All she said was that she was arrested in her pyjamas, which is absolutely true. She was arrested in her nightwear. That's undeniable. The police knew this was true. They absolutely knew it was true. I suspect the prosecution knew that it was true, although we can't say that absolutely definitively. What we can say is that this aspect of the prosecution was absolutely untrue. It is a lie. What Lucy's version of events that she gave in court, even though it's important to emphasise, it's a complete non-issue anyway. All she really said was, I was deeply traumatised, it was a deeply traumatic experience. Obviously that's true. That would be true if she was guilty. That would be true if anyone marched into your bedroom at 6 o'clock in the morning who was a stranger and you were still in bed. It would be scary. It's just a scary thing to happen. But if you've been arrested, then it's doubly scary. And if you've been arrested for supposed murder, it's triply scary. And then if you've not only been arrested for alleged murder, but you're also completely innocent, it's phenomenally scary. And you're there at 6 o'clock in the morning with police all the way around you, and they try and intimidate you as much as possible. It's noticeable if you look back at the earlier images, there's this big, strong police officer, male police officer, standing over, and they do try to intimidate you so that you'll be more compliant. And then once they've done that, they then kind of get the female officers to go, all right, Lucy, okay, can we just put your handcuffs on? Are you okay? How's your knee? You know, all that kind of stuff. So absolutely it was a traumatising experience. It'd be a traumatising experience for any man. It'd be a traumatising experience for Nick Johnson. It would be a traumatising experience for Paul Hughes. It'd be a traumatising experience for anyone in the police. That's undeniable. The pyjamas were just one small detail. They're not even an important detail. But as it happens, as we've seen continually all the way through this process, Lucy Letby's version of events is absolutely correct, and it's the prosecution that was lying. So I'll just read out this extract from the Telegraph article. Lucy Letby was arrested by police while still in bed, new footage shows. A trailer released for a new Netflix documentary about her case shows officers arriving at the nurse's family home and entering her bedroom. Letby is seen sitting up in bed, looking confused as police say they are arresting her on suspicion of murder and attempted murder. She is then shown being led away in her dressing gown. During her trial, Letby claims she had been taken to the police station in her pyjamas, which was disputed by the prosecution, who accused her of trying to garner sympathy with the jury. Nick Johnson KC said she was a very calculating woman. He added, the reason you tell lies is to try and get sympathy from people, you try and get attention from people. Letby was arrested 3 times. On the first occasion in July 2018, she was led out of her home wearing a blue tracksuit. Giving evidence, she said she recalled being taken away in her pyjamas, which we obviously now know to be true. So then we see this rather odd claim from Netflix that this is an unprecedented look into one of the most controversial cases of our time. I obviously personally wouldn't use the word controversial to describe it. I personally describe it as a debacle, one of the most shambolic cases of our time, although perhaps even that may not be entirely true because there are other equally shambolic cases. Maybe it's more accurate to describe it as one of the many shambolic cases of our time. But I was reflecting on why it would be unprecedented, and the only possible reason I can see for this is that the police don't usually go around filming stuff in the way that the Cheshire Police have and then give it to documentary filmmakers, and certainly not when there are massive doubts hanging over this case. And that further brings into focus what I discussed earlier, which is this whole process normal and is it appropriate? There are then a couple of uninteresting moments. We just see this stock footage of it being announced that Lucy Letby has been found guilty of murdering 7 newborn children. And then we see Lucy here and this comment about with never before seen footage. This appears to be her being incarcerated. This doesn't look like an interviewing room. It appears to be a cell. It looks like it's a holding cell. I must say that I've never been in a holding cell myself, and I've never seen a holding cell. I have been in the interior of a police station, but I've never been arrested. I mean, I'm sure that's coming. Cheshire Police are probably looking at me now, but at this point in time, I've never been in a holding cell and I've never been arrested. So I don't really know what they look like, but I'm assuming that this is a holding cell. Lucy is handcuffed. Maybe it's just some room they put people in while they're waiting to be interviewed. I'm not really entirely sure, but it doesn't appear to be an interviewing room, and obviously Lucy is handcuffed. And Netflix are boasting here that they've got never before seen footage. Again, the question would be, why are Cheshire Police compiling footage of someone that they later use in this documentary when this is a first arrest? As I say, I do have expert opinion coming up on this, but I'll just give my view at this point. The Operation Hummingbird film that Cheshire Police made themselves, they claim that they arrested Lucy Letby because she's the person that knows the most about the case. So they tried to claim, as we'll see in a future episode, I've made a few episodes on that film already. I haven't got to the bit where they make that claim, but I will make more episodes and we'll get to that claim imminently. If new massive news doesn't keep coming out every day as it is at the moment. But they say, we just arrested Lucy because we wanted to ask a few questions because she's got so much knowledge about the case. Now, that was always completely disingenuous because Paul Hughes of Cheshire Police admitted to Liz Hull and Caroline Cheetham that he basically already decided that she was guilty when the first arrest occurred. But also we know for a fact, because we've seen quite a bit of the police interviews and we've seen what occurred in court, that Cheshire Police never took on board anything that Lucy said. They just used anything they possibly could against her from those interviews. And of course, if you want to speak to someone, If the police wish to speak to someone, you ask them to come voluntarily. You don't arrest them. They're making it sound like it was, oh, we just wanted to speak to her so we could see what she had to say. Well, you don't handcuff them and then tell them they're not free to leave under those circumstances. So it was always an utterly disingenuous comment in the first place. But now we can see that unless Lucy Letby incredibly coincidentally happened to wear the same clothes on later arrests as she did for the first address, which seems extremely unlikely that they were filming her on the first arrest. So to me, that indicates even more strongly that they already, had very strong suspicions at best that she was guilty. So in my view, this kind of indicates that Cheshire Police didn't go into this first interview with an open mind. Of course, Paul Hughes' comments indicate that as well. They haven't heard anything from Lucy yet, and they haven't determined anything. She might have exceptional explanations for everything that occurred on the unit. Of course, as we know, we've looked at interviews previously, what the police actually asked her to do was absurd and ridiculous. She gave a very reasonable, very fluent interview. It was the interview of a knowledgeable neonatal nurse. But I think there's increasing indication that Cheshire Police already believed her to be guilty, and there's nothing that she could possibly have said in her defence at that point that would have helped her. Indeed, we know for a fact that they threw everything away. So when Paul Hughes says that we wanted to speak with her because she knows so much about the case, I don't think even he can possibly believe that, but certainly we know now that it's a claim that just has no merit whatsoever. And it's my personal belief that the footage we're seeing here indicates that this was never an information gathering exercise. The next couple of images and this next section in the trailer are rather uninteresting, just talking about, did this unassuming nurse really kill babies? Of course, we know that she didn't. We know that the infants died for medical reasons and due to mistakes made on the unit and due to the fact that they were very unwell in the first place. So then there's this reference to there being exclusive testimonials, and we do learn from this trailer the identity of at least a few of those people. There's Simon Blackwell from Cheshire Police, and a couple more exclusive testimonials and commenters will be revealed in the remainder of the video. We then see some further footage of Lucy, obviously very upset, which is regrettable. There's not a lot more than I can say about that. Of course she would be upset. Of course this was a traumatic experience. The whole thing's been completely devastating for her. There's then a bit with Simon Blackwell of Cheshire Police making this statement about things being not so straightforward. We'll obviously learn more about what the police say later in this documentary when it's released. We don't know at this point in time. I won't jump to any conclusions. I'll simply release the documentary when it is available. And then there's Lucy saying in the police interview, I felt like I'd only done my best for the babies. And I think we can say very confidently that she did only do her best for those babies. Indeed, that's why she was doing a lot of shifts. That's why she was dealing with complex cases. That's why she's there on the scene and often raising the alarm in these cases that's not contested by anyone. We then see further footage of Lucy in the police station being filmed again. I suppose if we're honest from an inquisitive perspective, it will be interesting to see some of this footage, and quite possibly it will humanise Lucy. It seems deeply ironic to me that they've blurred out an image of someone in the background. A person who presumably works for the police is not allowed to be in the documentary, so we have to protect his privacy, but we're filming Lucy Letby and we're going to pass that to Netflix at a time when there is enormous doubt regarding her convictions. It does smack, the whole thing to me smacks of them being too excited about doing a big case, and one wonders if they were already thinking about how they would be heroes and so forth. And I'll discuss that a bit later in the video because we're going to move on to some other aspects before we do that. Then we see Lucy's barrister, Mark McDonald, for the first time, and he obviously states here that there's no motive. Indeed, no motive was suggested by the prosecution or the police. Then he goes into this kind of social media section that's pretty poor, if you ask me, just suggesting that, oh look, people are having different opinions on social media. Quite specious, really. I suppose they're trying to appeal to every demographic because, with the greatest respect to people that follow this case, this applies to me as well, of course, it's usually an older demographic. They very noticeably use young people here, so they're trying to say to young people, this is something you should be interested in, and to be honest, that's welcomed. So perhaps this is not such a bad thing, although I think it's pretty corny, to be perfectly honest. We then see some footage of the by now infamous press conference in which Professor Shoo, who's pictured here with Sir David Davis, state that we didn't find any evidence of murder at the hospital, and also, notably, that if the hospital was in Canada, where Professor Lee has spent his professional career, it would have been closed down. We then see more footage from this fairly astounding press conference, and we don't only see Professor Lee and Sir David Davis, but we also see this footage here of the people that were in attendance. And I sort of recognise a few of them, but I won't point anyone out in case they don't want to be recognised. But they're in the film now, so they'll have to get used to it, I guess. And then there's an image of Lucy, and it's perhaps not evident here, well, it isn't evident, that Lucy's shaking her head in disbelief, seemingly. She's still in her own house here, and they're just filming her in her own house. And then we see the appearance of Professor Shoo Lee. So this could be described as a genuine exclusive. I didn't know that he'd spoken with Netflix, and obviously he's a very important figure in this case because not only has he been central to this panel that's provided this top-notch medical evidence indicating that there are no murders, but also his paper was misused critically in the court case, and that is one of the primary reasons why this is such an unsafe conviction. There is then more footage of Lucy looking very upset in her house, being handcuffed. Of course, you would expect her to be upset. I don't know if it's painful. It must be uncomfortable. But clearly the emotional aspect of it is the thing that would upset her the most. And then there's a little bit of a surprise with Dr. John Gibbs appearing, saying, I don't think there was a miscarriage of justice. But then he says, no one actually saw her do it. So what I'd say to Dr. Gibbs is, I believe you found God recently, so I'd start praying, son, if I were you. The next sequence will be upsetting for a lot of people. It's very sad for me to see Lucy with her cat. This was filmed at her parents' house, I believe, and she's just literally cuddling a pet and saying, I don't know when I'm going to be back. I don't know if this is a second arrest or a third arrest, who knows, maybe that will be made clear in the documentary, though I think that's doubtful. I'm not even sure if this is a parent's house because she's dressed the same way, so maybe this is the first arrest. But anyway, she's saying goodbye to a cat. It's just a very quiet, private, intimate moment with an animal that we don't really need to see in a Netflix documentary put on TV, even if it's a guilty person, let alone it's a person that basically we know to be innocent. There's overwhelming doubt about the cases. This must be overturned. To show this kind of private moment and say, oh, look, here we are, look at the great footage we've captured of Lucy with a cat is, I think, enormously distasteful. I can't remember if I've said this previously on the channel, but I'll just reflect on this for a second now. I think I would cope okay in prison if I was kept in solitary confinement. I'd rather be kept in solitary confinement than be in the prison population. But the thing that would be hardest for me is that if I couldn't see my dog anymore, I couldn't be anything other than unhappy. I mean, I couldn't be in a stable frame of mind. I would just be depressed and feel lost. And to think that I wouldn't be there when I couldn't be with Kiko when she passed away. I mean, it's horrible to even think that she'll pass away one day, but I've tried to kind of process this in my brain and try to prepare myself for it. I'm sure that I'll be inconsolable for quite a considerable period of time, but to be separate from her and not be able to be there for her and not be able to see her again, and then she just disappears, obviously, while I'm still in prison, eventually, would be the worst thing that could possibly happen to me. Obviously, Lucy is facing this possibility with her parents as well. This must have been enormously difficult for Lucy. It's hardly surprising that she cried in court when she saw her cats. The fact that they tried to hold this against her is just part of this whole avalanche of monstrous things that have happened to Lucy. Completely unforgivable. Of course, we'd be enormously disappointed if Dr. Dewi Evans didn't put in a final appearance in this documentary. Now, despite this, I was still a little bit disappointed that he's not wearing his mustard jumper. Incredibly, he's actually shelled out on a horrible suit for this appearance. So I was somewhat disappointed to see that. Nevertheless, it would be tragic if Dr. Evans wasn't part of these proceedings after his prolific media commentary of the last 3 years. I think the only thing that's more overexposed on television than Dr. Evans is the BBC series Traitors. I did also notice that he's not wearing his glasses, which is very rare. I could make numerous comments about that, but I won't. I'm sure that Dr. Evans will give his usual guileless commentary on matters, but we don't hear from him again in this trailer. They just move on to the next segment, which is deeply ironic because it includes the commentary that this evidence was pointing towards Lucy Letby, and then to back that up, they've got a picture of the shift chart that is now approximately as valuable as toilet paper. The next person to appear is Danielle Stonier. Now, we know from a Daily Mail podcast that she conducted 2/3 of the interviews with Lucy Letby, despite the fact that she was a family liaison officer and was heavily involved with the families related to the indictment. When I went over the interview that Danielle Stonier gave to the Daily Mail in this previous video, what did Lucy Letby, police interviewer, say about her, we discovered that she made some pretty strange comments, as indeed many of the police officers from Cheshire Police seem to do every time they're interviewed in any forum whatsoever. We then see more footage of Lucy looking very traumatised and sad. She looks worn out and exhausted in this particular footage. It's not clear where and when this has been filmed. I wondered if this was when she was incarcerated. It doesn't look like her bedroom and her bed that we've seen in previous images, but it also does look quite personalised, so maybe this is a room that's been made up for in a parent's house, possibly, and possibly that's where she's been arrested on this occasion. But again, I would ask the question of why is all this footage being accumulated, and were they ever open-minded about the guilt of Lucy Letby or otherwise? You know, we see these kind of half-baked claims from Cheshire Police in other videos, particularly the film that they made themselves, that, oh, you know, we've considered a wide range of possibilities. But really, from examining what they've said previously, and also now these leaked documents that we have that I'll be analysing soon in the forthcoming video, they were obviously too busy focused on congratulating themselves and filming Lucy Letby and getting overexcited about the fact they were doing something significant in their small police station. It seems very, very obvious to me that they became overexcited, and it's also blindingly obvious that they never examined any possibility other than malfeasance from Lucy Letby, and they did a lousy job of investigating that. So then we have Dr. Evans doing the voiceover for this part, although tragically we don't get to see him again. And he says there was a poisoner on the ward, which is ironic because he didn't actually give evidence for these cases, although he did say certain things about the insulin cases which are completely unfounded and that he's not qualified to talk about. But he's no stranger to speaking outside of his expertise, because there's yet another case that's come up in which he's spoken outside of his expertise, if indeed you can describe him as an expert at this point, because he's been retired for 20 years. It's literally 19 years since he worked in a hospital now. He was deregistered in 2009, but I believe he last worked in a hospital in 2007. So whether you could even describe him as an expert, I don't know. He still likes to describe himself in the present tense as a consultant paediatrician, as if he's still working. But regardless of this, he knows nothing about the insulin cases. He knows nothing about insulin. He's not qualified. He didn't even know you could measure insulin in more than one way. He conceded this himself, so he shouldn't have been commenting on it. And it's ironic that he's commenting on it in this documentary, seemingly. So we'll have to see what happens. I'm sure that he couldn't possibly give a good account of himself in this documentary. It's literally impossible, because he said so many things by this point in time that he would inevitably have to contradict something that he said at some other time. The only way he could fail to do that was if he turned up to the documentary and said, "My name is Dr. Dewi Evans. I was an expert witness in the Lucy Letby case. Lucy Letby was found guilty. Thank you. Goodbye." That's pretty much the only way that he could avoid contradicting something that he said either since or before that this was filmed. So then the final sequence in this documentary sees Lucy explaining that she loved her job, which I don't think anyone reasonably doubts. She's an enormously dedicated person. She studied incredibly hard. She was highly regarded by people on the unit. She was highly regarded by people who tutored her during her study, who oversaw her training and so forth. So that's not a surprise to us. And then in this very final segment, they show Lucy being interviewed by the police and saying it was all just spiralling out of control. And of course, things have got a lot worse for her since then. If you know how unsafe this conviction is, if you know all the evidence pointing to Lucy Letby being innocent, then of course it's very upsetting to see Lucy in these circumstances, and yet things would still get worse for her. Obviously because of the strength of support that she has now, both in terms of the general public and in terms of those that have provided medical evidence in her defence, she's in a better position now than she has been for a while. And with the CPS charges being dropped recently, that shows that they knew they couldn't take the case to court because they'd be annihilated by these experts. So that gives Lucy hope, and there is the hope that she can be exonerated, which she certainly should be. Finally, this documentary will be released on the 4th of February, so you can be certain I will be reviewing this in the immediate aftermath. I don't know what to expect from this documentary in terms of quality, but I'll try to go into it with an open mind. It will be interesting to see what the protagonists of this prosecution have to say and how it matches up to statements that they've made previously. So I want to go over a couple of reactions to this trailer. There has been quite a lot, and a lot of it has been, I think it's reasonable to describe it as vitriolic. I'm going to read out a couple of tweets from Nadine Dorries, the MP, firstly. And she comments here, Judith Moritz made BBC Panorama programme about Letby, aired on the same night. Her book about Letby was published for personal gain and profit. She lined her own pockets using BBC resources, and it's likely made the programme as sensational as possible in order to increase her book sales. This needs investigating by the BBC and DCMS. The additional charges brought by the police were dismissed by the Crown Prosecution Service as the original charges should have been. Missing a witness prepared to line his or her own pockets and provide dubious, wrong, fabricated information, Cheshire Police now cannot stand the new charges up in the same way the original charges should never have been up for consideration. The basis upon which Letby was convicted is crumbling to dust before our eyes. And she then also made this comment, which I entirely agree with, regarding the Netflix trailer. She says, firstly, will be sensational biased in order to attract viewing figures. I think it's quite likely to be sensational. Hopefully, they've recognised that it needs to be a little bit more balanced than it probably was going to be originally. So let's just try to go into it with an open mind. But I can see a point of view on that. But I definitely agree with the other comments completely. How did Netflix obtain video from Cheshire Police, which public have no access to, despite the fact they paid for it? Our justice system is on its knees and bordering on corrupt. The only thing you could possibly disagree with is whether or not it's bordering on corrupt or whether it's not just actually corrupt. And then I want to just read this post by Dr. Svilena Dimitrova, which is very eloquent, quite a lengthy post, but I think important to go through all of it. What we are seeing in this interrogation is a textbook example of intimidation-based bullying, a tactic routinely employed by people who exhibit predatory behaviours when they are protected by institutional power. Cross-examination is supposed to test evidence, but instead this is a technique used and indeed taught to psychologically dominate, destabilise or publicly humiliate a witness. This is a great example of how it's done, but also it's a great example of how any piece of irrelevant garbage can be used to do it. In this case, whether the defendant was wearing a nightie, pyjamas or a tracksuit when arrested early in the morning, whilst in bed. The early morning arrest while she was in bed was clearly a necessary manoeuvre, was it, Cheshire Police? The pyjamas question quite obviously has no bearing on motive, means, opportunity or intent. It does not advance the truth of any allegation of murder or any other crime. At best, it could be used to explore memory reliability under stress, but that is not what happens here. Instead, the detail is repeated relentlessly long after uncertainty is acknowledged and concessions are made. Confusion is reframed as dishonesty, and dishonesty is escalated into a full character attack. You lied, you are calculating, you seek sympathy, you seek attention. At that point, the questioning is nothing to do with establishing facts at all. It is about breaking the person in front of an audience. Normal human memory under stress then becomes evidence of bad character. A discrepancy about clothing is evidence of guilt. The implicit logic, if she lied about something small, she must be lying about everything, is character assassination, which works in the eyes of the intellectually challenged or uneducated. The most revealing moment is when statements are framed as questions. You are a very calculating woman, aren't you? These are not questions, they are accusations designed to assault the witness. This is abuse through dominance dressed as inquiry. What makes this especially disturbing is that many people assume such conduct is merely allowed in court. In reality, it's not just allowed, it is actively encouraged. Institutions reward those who are aggressive and performatively confident. Bullying is rebranded as advocacy or testing credibility. This dynamic is not unique to courtrooms. It plays out anywhere. Predatory personalities occupy positions of authority, whether hospitals, corporations, universities, or public services. The NHS is full of such figures, and this has significantly worsened in the last 20 years. The pattern is always the same. Trivial errors are magnified, attention is diverted from what actually matters, and power is exercised through humiliation. The goal is not truth, the goal is control. And the truth dies and gets buried somewhere during that process, very rarely to be found. Absolutely 100% questioning should be allowed, people must be challenged, claims must be tested, but there is a clear difference between rigorous questioning and predatory behaviour. While some people should feel genuine shame about the choices they made when wielding power, I do not believe this issue is, however, primarily about individual bad actors. The real problem is collective tolerance. It's the people who look away that make this erosion of humanity possible. And this is why abuse persists and thrives. Institutions do not change because of lone bullies, they persist because audiences start to tolerate and eventually normalise cruelty. This is also why we have a mental health epidemic. We are surrounded by abusers, those who tolerate them and thus enable them, their victims, and those who pretend they see or hear nothing. If we want to arrest this cycle of decline we are living through, the place to start is not with demonising individuals, but with society refusing to excuse abusive behaviours en masse. What I should say as well is that when the police entered into this Netflix production, it was going to be some sort of self-congratulatory lap of honour, like the end of a Formula One Grand Prix. But of course the climate has completely shifted since then, and many people know that they're completely incompetent. And of course people that have followed the case closely, or not even necessarily particularly closely, now overwhelmingly, I would say bare minimum 95%, believe that it's an unsafe conviction, and that at the very least there should be a retrial. So when they originally entered into this agreement with Netflix, they're probably stupid enough, as we've seen with their own promotional film, to believe that they'd done everything in exemplary fashion and that this was going to be something of a hero worshipping for them once this documentary was released. Unfortunately for them, that's not going to be the case. And in the climate that exists today, it seems particularly extraordinary that all of this footage has been released to Netflix and now they're going to put it out on TV when there are massive, at best, question marks over this conviction. Of course, I believe that it's entirely unsafe and I believe that Lucy Letby is innocent. So I asked Dr. Steve Watts, who's a police investigator, for those who don't know, had a very credentialed, garlanded career as a police investigator. He's been an interviewee on the channel twice previously, for those that don't know, and I'm fortunate that I can ask him questions when I need to. So I asked him a few questions about this trailer just to get his response. So the first question I asked was, do you have a general reaction to this trailer and its appropriateness? And Steve said, I am shocked by the trailer given that it shows footage of Lucy Letby being arrested whilst in bed. Whatever your opinion on this case, this is, I think, an egregious invasion of privacy. I cannot see how such footage will add to the documentary itself in achieving its aim of being an insight into the case. In my view, this is prurient sensationalism. What do you think about Cheshire Police entering into an agreement like this with Netflix? In general terms, there is precedent for police forces collaborating with television companies to produce informative documentaries around significant cases. However, it is usual for the cases to have been resolved for some time and there are no outstanding questions regarding guilt because the process is at an end. I think the Cheshire Police have been wrong to do so in this case. It is patently obvious that there are very significant concerns regarding the convictions, not just from people like myself, but very eminent scientists, medical professionals, statisticians, a former very senior judge, and senior members of Parliament, including a former Minister for Health. This documentary will only add more heat rather than light to the situation. I think the Cheshire Police have been unprofessional, naive and arrogant in supporting this programme. I have to wonder what the Chief Constable and the Police and Crime Commissioner are doing, allowing Cheshire Police to participate in this project. There must be a gold group in place due to the reputational issues for Cheshire Police. It will be interesting to see the documentation in respect to the decision to cooperate with this documentary, in particular what the organisation saw as a benefit to them. And then I've asked this third question: is it normal to film as much as they did? Why are they filming Lucy during what seems to be her first arrest when they're not even supposed to have decided that she's guilty? Is this normal practice? It is normal when making significant arrests to film the whole event, often on body-worn cameras. This is in order to secure evidence the suspect may say or do something that is relevant, and to mitigate any later complaints about police conduct during the arrest and searches. I am not surprised that the event was filmed. What astonishes me is that such footage was passed to the production company. I do have questions as to why it was seen as necessary, given the circumstances and her profile, to arrest Lucy Letby in such a manner, particularly whilst in bed. All police activity must be justified, necessary and proportionate. I would be interested to see the documentation that will be held by Cheshire Police, which provides the rationale for arrest, the method of arrest, and particularly the decision to place her in handcuffs and how those actions are articulated in terms of justification, necessity and proportionality. So I mentioned earlier we now have this document with numerous leaked documents included that gives us a real and even deeper insight to the police investigation than we had already. And I will be covering that in future episodes. I'm not quite sure when that will happen. I've been planning it, but then new stuff keeps coming up. But that really gives us very deep and troubling insight into just how flawed this investigation was and the very basic mistakes that were made. So I just want to reassure people that I will be covering that soon. I'm also just going to go through the other police videos that I've already recorded for this channel. This is really for people primarily who perhaps aren't familiar with the case. They may have just seen the Netflix trailer and they may have clicked on this video. So the very first one I made 8 months ago was about whether or not Lucy Letby wrote a code in her diary, as was alleged by the police. Now, it's absolutely blatantly obvious that she did not write a code in her diary. So that video covers that reality. This video, Lucy Letby, What Happened in Key Cheshire Police Meeting, looks at a meeting that occurred on the 15th of May 2017 that involves the two people on the screen there, Dr. Stephen Breary, who was a consultant at the Council of Chester Hospital, and Paul Hughes, who was, I believe, he led the investigation. I think his rank is detective inspector or something. It doesn't really matter. He led the investigation and he allowed, along with Nigel Wenham, who was also involved in the investigation, another Cheshire Police officer, he allowed Dr. Stephen Breary, Dr. Ravi Jairam, and to a lesser extent Dr. Susie Holt to walk into the police station and convince the police to investigate when 3 days previous to that they had no intention of doing so. So this was just a monumental blunder, and if this hadn't have happened, this was one of 20 ways that I identified where this could have been stopped. So just if the police had shown a bit more questioning mentality and a bit more competence, instead of just accepting what the consultant said at face value, then this could all have been prevented. So this video covers that. Then there's what really happened when Lucy Letby was arrested. So that deals with her first arrest and her first interview, and we see Lucy giving very fluent, very clearly honest answers to the questions that she's asked, which we know the police completely ignored. This video deals with the full timeline of everything that the police did, everything that Cheshire Police did, which is really quite extraordinary when you look at it all. That's also covered in my book that will be released in either June or July. Then we also analysed Liz Hull interviewing Paul Hughes, who I mentioned as the police officer who led the investigation. Liz Hull is this Daily Mail journalist who's made a podcast with Caroline Cheetham, and so we examined what Paul Hughes said to Liz Hull when he was interviewed, and he said numerous extraordinary things. Then this video is another one that looks at, this is the initial video that looks at their promotional film. They describe it as a documentary about Operation Hummingbird. This is the first part of examining their documentary, as they describe it, and all of the ridiculous things that they said. I've already made the second part of that, and it's pretty extraordinary you can see in that documentary, as I could see within days of seeing it for the first time, all of the mistakes that they've made. And now we know that they made those mistakes because of what's been revealed since. So my initial suspicions that I worked out from the documentary that they made and they released, and I saw that, and it was only a few days after Lucy Letby had been convicted, and I could see all the mistakes that they made in their investigation from that documentary that they themselves made and they themselves released. And now we know that all the suspicions I had and that I could see immediately are all true, and yet they could never see them. The next thing is Lucy Letby, why was the police investigation so flawed? So this again investigates, examines and analyses many problems with the police investigation of Lucy Letby. This video examines a document that was provided by Dr. Ravi Jairam, who was a consultant at the hospital who's centrally involved in this case, and he sent this to the police. Dr. Stephen Brewer is involved as well, who I've mentioned previously, and it was supposed to provide a rationale for why the police should investigate. The police bought this hook, line and sinker. In this video, I analyse all the problems with that document and how little relevance it ultimately had to the indictment, but it was still used to justify the indictment. Then in this video I mentioned previously, we look at Danielle Stonier being interviewed by the Daily Mail and the kind of absurd and ridiculous comments that she makes during this interview. So that would bring us right up to the present, and then I've also done a second part video looking at the Operation Hummingbird documentary. So I'm just going through those things just to show you there's already 10, 11 videos on this channel about the police investigation, going into great depth. So we already know a lot, and there'll be a lot more revealed in the days, weeks and months to come, and there'll be a lot more revealed in my book. And we know that the police were incompetent. We know the police did a terrible job. The last thing that I should mention that I haven't included here is that I've also interviewed Stephanie Davies, who worked on the investigation twice. She's now a whistleblower who believes that Lucy Letby is innocent and believes it's an incompetent investigation. And I've interviewed the aforementioned Dr. Steve Watts, who also believes that this was a miscarriage of justice and is very critical of the police investigation, as indeed he has been critical of the police in the comments that I've recorded for this video. So the final concluding comments that I would make with regards to this trailer is that firstly, there's no legitimate argument against the recording and public release of all court footage and police interviews, or at the very least there need to be transcripts made available. If people need to be kept anonymous for some reason and they have to give transcripts instead of recordings, I suppose that's okay, but there are other countries where they record court proceedings, and I cannot see any even remotely legitimate argument for not making this process as transparent as possible. Indeed, when I interviewed the lady who's on the screen here, Anna Doherty, she said the reason that it's not done is not to help the defendant, it's to help the system. And the system doesn't need any further help. It's already put on a pedestal, I think it's fair to describe it as, and it should be held to account, not put on a pedestal. It should be more transparent. And the fact is, we know that a central and heavily reported claim in this court case was simply untrue. We know that for an absolute fact now, and yet it's gone before the jury as being legitimate. And in fact, we know the prosecution was lying. There's a very, 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 very small chance that Nick Johnson didn't know that he was lying and the police have misled him. But the police sat there in court and watched this unfold, knowing that what the prosecution was saying was completely untrue. And there has been an enormous amount of abuse directed at Lucy Letby over this pajama gate, as I've described it. You know, she was described as a liar in court, and countless people, the people who are obsessed with trying to pretend that she's guilty, still cite this and still say, "Oh, she lied about her pajamas," and they've been incredibly abusive towards her, and even towards people who have questioned the conviction in relation to this issue of the pajamas. But now we know for a fact that Lucy was completely correct. Lucy's account of the events was completely accurate. Lucy was telling the truth, and that it was the prosecution that was lying. So I assume that these abusive people will now turn their attention to Cheshire Police, because I'm sure they're mature enough to do that, and I'm sure they're mature enough to admit that they've made a massive mistake, not for the first time. The reality is, as this documentary comes out, is that the climate has changed significantly. Cheshire Police thought they would release this documentary, they would give this footage, and they'd all be patted on the back for doing a wonderful job. That's not the case anymore. I don't necessarily expect this Netflix film to be particularly great, but I'll try to go into it with an open mind, and I will, of course, be covering it in February, immediately after the film being released on the 4th of February. So that's all I have to say in this video. I hope you found this to be enlightening and enjoyable, and I look forward to reading your comments.